What does it mean to believe? Faith is the fundamental act of Christian existence. The essential structure of Christianity finds expression in the act of faith, which is the answer it gives to the question, how can we attain our destiny and thereby realize our humanity? There are, of course, other answers. Not all religions are a faith. For example, Buddhism, in its classical form, does not at all tend toward this act of self-transcendence, of encounter with the one who is totally other, with this God who speaks to me or who summons me to love. Instead, Buddhism is characterized by an act of radical internalization, not an act that makes one emerge from oneself, but an act of returning into oneself. This act is meant to lead to liberation from the yoke of individuality, from the burden represented by the fact of being a person, to a return into the common unity of being. Compared with the experience we have of being, we can describe the absolute otherness of this being as non-being, as nothing. 1. Faith and everyday life, a fundamental human attitude. It is not my intention to enter this particular discussion. What interests us for the moment is, put very simply, how to understand the fundamental act of Christian existence, the act of faith. As soon as we set out on this path of reflection, we encounter a difficulty, since we must ask, is faith truly an attitude worthy of a modern adult? Believing seems a provisional, transitory stage that ought, in the last analysis, to be left behind. Although this is often inevitable in our life, precisely because we are speaking here of a provisional attitude. No one is truly capable of possessing a personal knowledge and mastery of all those realities on which our daily life in a technological society is based. We are obliged to accept an enormous number of things, in most cases putting our trust in science, and all the more so because the experience we have in common seems a sufficient confirmation of this trust. All of us, to a greater or lesser degree, make use of the products of technology, although we are ignorant of its scientific foundations. Which of us can calculate or verify the statics of a building? Which of us knows how an elevator works, to say nothing of the worlds of electricity and electronics which are so familiar to us? And how far, to move on to a much more delicate subject, can we trust the information on the packaging of a pharmaceutical compound? We could multiply examples. We live within a network of unknown quantities, with the general expectation that these will provide us with positive experiences. We believe that all this is not unfounded, and this kind of faith allows us to enjoy the benefits of other people's professional knowledge. But what kind of faith is this which we practice all the time without even noticing, and which is at the basis of the life we share every day? Without at once trying to offer a definition, let us begin on the level of what is immediately observable. Two contrasting aspects of this kind of faith strike us at once. First of all, we can affirm that a faith of this kind is indispensable in our life. This is true for the simple reason that, if this were not the case, nothing would function anymore. Each one of us would have to start afresh all the time. This is also true on a deeper level, in the sense that human life becomes impossible if one can no longer trust the other and others. If one cannot rely a priori on their experience and knowledge and on what they offer us. This is one of the positive aspects of this faith. On the other hand, of course, it is the expression of an ignorance that makes the best of a bad job. It would undeniably be better if we did possess the appropriate knowledge. We have elaborated here what we might call an axiological structure of this natural faith. We have examined the values it contains and seen that such a faith is a lesser value than knowledge, but at the same time a foundational value of human existence. Without this basis, no society could survive. We can also identify the various elements involved in the structure of action of such a faith. These are 3 in number. First, this faith always refers to someone who possesses up-to-date knowledge of the question. It presupposes that qualified and credible persons do, in fact, possess this knowledge. The second element is the trust on the part of the multitude of those who, in the daily use they make of things, do not rely on the solid knowledge that actually produced them. Finally, the third element we must mention is the existence of a kind of verification of knowledge in daily experience. I am not capable of verifying scientifically whether the act of switching on a reading lamp is the result of a process based on the principles of electricity, but this does not lead me to reject the affirmation that this is in fact the case, because my household appliances function in daily life despite my own lack of professional knowledge. This means that although I may not have been initiated into this knowledge, nevertheless, I am not acting in a pure faith bereft of any kind of confirmation. Two, can agnosticism be a solution? All this opens up perspectives on religious faith and allows us to discern some structural analogies, but as soon as we attempt to pass to this level, we encounter an objection that has a certain weight and could be formulated as follows. It may indeed be true that within the network of human relationships, it is impossible for each individual to know everything that is necessary and useful for life, and that, therefore, our possibilities for action are based on the fact that we ourselves participate by faith in the knowledge of others. Nevertheless, we remain all the time within the sphere of human knowledge that is always in principle accessible to all men. When, however, we speak of faith in revelation, we pass beyond the boundaries of that knowledge which is typical of human life. Even if the hypothesis be granted that the existence of God could become an object of knowledge, at least revelation and its contents would remain an object of faith for each one of us, something that surpasses those realities that are accessible to our knowledge. Consequently, in this field there is no one in whom we could put our trust, or to whose specialist knowledge we could refer, since no one could have a direct knowledge of such realities on the basis of his own personal studies. This means that we are confronted once again, and in an even more urgent fashion, with the problem: is this type of faith compatible with modern critical knowledge? Would it not be more appropriate for an adult of our times to refrain from expressing judgments on such matters, and to wait for the day when science will have definitive answers even to this kind of question. The attitude revealed in this way of putting the problem is undoubtedly that of the average person with a university education today. Intellectual honesty and humility in the face of the unknown seem to recommend agnosticism rather than an explicit atheism, since the latter too claims to know too much about these things and clearly has a dogmatic element of its own. No one can claim to know, strictly speaking, that God does not exist. One can at most take his non-existence as a working hypothesis, on the basis of which one then tries to explain the universe. Modern science basically takes this line. Nevertheless, this kind of methodological approach is aware of its limitations. Clearly, it is never possible to get beyond the sphere of the hypothetical. No matter how evident an atheistic interpretation of the universe may appear, it will never lead to the scientific certainty that God does not exist. No one can carry out experiments on the totality of existence or its preconditions. This brings us in a very straightforward manner to the unsurpassable limits inherent in the human condition and in man's capacity for knowledge qua man, that is, not merely with regard to his present-day circumstances, but in terms of his very essence. Of its nature, the question of God cannot forcibly be made an object of scientific research in the strict sense of that term, and this means that the declaration of scientific atheism is an absurd claim, yesterday, today, or tomorrow. This, however, makes it all the more urgent to know whether the question of God does surpass the limits of human capabilities as such, so that agnosticism would in fact be the only correct attitude for man. The acknowledgement, appropriate and honest, devout in the profound meaning of that word, of that which eludes our grasp and our field of vision, a reverence vis-à-vis something that is inaccessible to us. Might not this be a new form of intellectual devotion, to leave aside whatever lies beyond our grasp, and be content with what we are permitted to know? An authentic believer who wishes to reply to this question must be on his guard against an unreflecting haste. This type of humility and devotion calls forth at once an objection. Is it not perhaps the case that the thirst for the infinite is a fundamental aspect of human nature? Is not indeed this thirst the very essence of human nature? Its only limit can be that which is illimitable, and the limits of science must not be confused with the limits of our existence as such, for that would be a failure to comprehend either science or man. If science were to claim to exhaust the limits of human knowledge, it would end up by denying its own scientific character. All this seems to me undoubtedly true, but as a reply, it is, as I have said, premature. We ought rather to examine patiently the plausibility of the hypothesis of agnosticism, and see whether it can hold up as a response not only to science, but also to human life. The true way to call agnosticism into question is to ask whether its program can be realized. Is it possible for us, as human beings, purely and simply to lay aside the question of God, that is, the question of our origin, of our final destiny, and of the measure of our existence? Can we be content to live under the hypothetical formula as if God did not exist, while it is possible that he does in fact exist? The question of God is not merely a theoretical problem for man, like, for example, the problem of knowing whether there exist other elements as yet unknown outside the periodic table. On the contrary, the question of God is an eminently practical problem, with consequences in every sphere of our lives. Even if I throw in my theoretical lot with agnosticism, I am nevertheless compelled in practice to choose between two alternatives, either to live as if God did not exist, or else to live as if God did exist, and was the decisive reality of my existence. If I act according to the first alternative, I have in practice adopted an atheistic position, and have made a hypothesis, which may also be false, the basis of my entire life. If I decide for the second option, I remain here too in the sphere of a purely human belief, and one can certainly recall in this context the proposal made by Pascal, whose philosophical controversy, at the dawn of the modern age, dealt with this problem. Having reached the conviction that the question could not in reality be resolved by means of thought alone, he recommended that the agnostic risk taking the second option and live as if God existed. According to Pascal, it is in the course of experience, and only thanks to experience, that at some point the agnostic will recognize the correctness of his choice. Let us leave this question here. It is clear that the prestige enjoyed by the agnostic solution today does not stand up to closer examination. As a pure theory, it may seem exceedingly illuminating, but in its essence, agnosticism is much more than a theory. What is at stake here is the praxis of one's life. When one attempts to put it into practice in one's real field of action, agnosticism slips out of one's hands like a soap bubble. It dissolves into thin air because it is not possible to escape the very option it seeks to avoid. When faced with the question of God, man cannot permit himself to remain neutral. All he can say is yes or no, without ever avoiding all the consequences that derive from this choice, even in the smallest details of life. Accordingly, we see that the question of God is ineluctable. One is not permitted to abstain from casting one's vote. Obviously, however, the conditions relevant to the knowledge of God are necessarily of a particular kind. In this question, we are not analyzing isolated fragments of reality that we might in some way take into our hands, verify experientially, and then master. This question regards not that which is below us, but that which is above us. It regards not something we could dominate, but that which exercises its lordship over us and over the whole of reality. Even when I encounter another person, I am not capable within a single glance of penetrating the depths of his character and the vast expanses of his spirit in the same way I can examine a piece of matter or some other living organism. How much less will I be able to approach the very foundation of the universe in this manner? This does not mean that we have now entered the sphere of the irrational. On the contrary, what we are looking for is the very foundation of all rationality. We are inquiring into how its light can be perceived. To explain this point in detail, much more time would be required than is available for one single lecture. But there is one fundamental point that seems obvious to me. Where everything and the foundations of everything are involved, the one who endeavors to comprehend is inevitably challenged to get involved with the totality of his being, with all the faculties of perception he has been given. And his search for knowledge must aim not only to collect a large number of individual details, but, as far as possible, to grasp the totality as such. We can also affirm that there are some fundamental human attitudes that are indispensable methodological presuppositions for the knowledge of God. These include listening to the message that is brought to us by our own existence and by the world in general, a vigilant attentiveness vis-à-vis the discoveries and the religious experience of humanity, and the decisive and persevering employment of our time and our internal energy on this problem, which concerns each one of us personally. (3) The natural knowledge of God. We must now inquire whether there is an answer to such a question for man, and if so, what kind of certainty we are allowed to attain. In his letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul found himself confronted precisely with these problems, and he responded with a philosophical reflection based on facts presented by the history of religions. In the megalopolis of Rome, the Babylon of that age, he encountered the type of moral decadence that comes from the total loss of tradition. People were deprived of that interior evidential character that in other times had been offered to man from the outset of his life by usages and customs. Where nothing can be taken for granted, everything becomes possible, and nothing is impossible any longer. Now there is no value capable of sustaining man, and there are no inviolable norms. All that counts is man's ego and the present moment. The traditional religions are merely comfortable facades, without any spirituality. All that remains is a naked and crude cynicism. The Apostle offers a surprising response to this metaphysical and moral cynicism of a decadent society, dominated only by the law of the jungle. He declares that, in reality, this society knows God very well. What can be known about God is plain to them. He then backs up this affirmation. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. And Paul draws the conclusion, so they are without excuse. According to the Apostle, the truth is accessible to them, but they do not want it, because they refuse the demands that the truth would make on them. In this context, he says that they, by their wickedness, suppress the truth. Man resists the truth that would demand a submission expressed in giving glory and thanks to God. For Paul, the moral decadence of society is nothing more than the logical consequence and the faithful reflection of this radical perversion. When man prefers his own egoism, his pride, and his convenience to the demands made on him by the truth, the only possible outcome is an upside-down existence. Adoration is due to God alone, but what is adored is no longer God. Images, outward appearances, and current opinion have dominion over man. This general alteration extends to every sphere of life. That which is against nature becomes the norm. The man who lives against the truth also lives against nature. His creativity is no longer at the service of the good. He devotes his genius to ever more refined forms of evil. The bonds between man and woman, and between parents and children, are dissolved, so that the very sources from which life springs are blocked up. It is no longer life that reigns, but death. A civilization of death is formed. The description of decadence that Paul sketches here astonishes us modern readers by its contemporary relevance. However, he is not content merely to describe, this state of affairs. There were many who did so in his days, and they display a perverse form of moralism that ends in taking pleasure precisely in the negative behavior it condemns. On the contrary, the apostles' analysis leads to a diagnosis, and hence takes the form of a moral appeal. At the origin of all these negative things lies the negation of the truth in favor of what is convenient, or rather, of what is profitable. The starting point in man is a resistance to the evidential character of the Creator that is present in his heart as the sign of a being who looks at him and summons him. Paul is far from regarding atheism, or an agnosticism that is lived out as atheism, as an innocent position. In his eyes, it is always the fruit of a refusal of that knowledge which is in fact offered to man. Man is unwilling to accept the conditions attached to this knowledge. Man is not condemned to remain in uncertainty about God. He can see him if he listens to the voice of God's being and to the voice of his creation and lets himself be guided by this. Paul knows nothing of an atheism governed by purely idealistic motives. What are we to say to this? Clearly, the apostle is playing in this passage on the contradiction between philosophy and religion that existed in antiquity. Greek philosophy had arrived at the knowledge of the one single foundation of the universe, the Spirit, who alone is worthy of the name of God, even if this knowledge existed in contradictory forms and was insufficiently detailed. But the energy that had sustained its critique of religion soon cooled down, and although this critical attitude was in fact an essential element in Greek philosophy, it increasingly turned to the justification of the worship of the gods and of the adoration of state power. It was therefore an obvious fact that the truth was kept a prisoner. In this sense, Paul's diagnosis is well-founded, when we bear in mind the historical situation he is addressing. But despite this, can we really say that his affirmations possess a value that goes beyond this specific historical constellation? Certainly, we would need to modify the details. Nevertheless, Paul's words are essentially painting the picture not of some particular historical situation, but of the permanent situation of humanity, of man, vis-à-vis God. The history of religions is coextensive with the history of humanity. As far as we know, there has never been an epoch in which the question of the one who is totally other, the divine, has been alien to man. The knowledge of God has always existed. And everywhere in the history of religions, in various forms, we encounter the significant conflict between the knowledge of the one God and the attraction of other powers that are considered more dangerous or nearer at hand, and therefore more important for man than the God who is distant and mysterious. All of history bears the traces of this strange dilemma between the non-violent, tranquil demands made by the truth on the one hand, and the pressure brought to make profits and the need to have a good relationship with the powers that determine daily life by their interventions on the other hand. Again and again we see the victory of profit over truth, although the signs of the truth and of its own power never disappear completely. Indeed, they continue to live, often in surprising forms, in the very heart of a jungle full of poisonous plants. But is this true even today, in a totally non-religious culture, in a culture of rationality and of the technology it harnesses? I believe that the answer is yes. For even today, the question man poses inevitably goes beyond the sphere of technological rationality. Even today, we do not limit ourselves to the question, "What can I do?" We also ask, "What ought I to do, and who am I?" There are, of course, cosmological evolutionist systems that elevate the non-existence of God to the level of an obvious truth of reason, and claim thereby to demonstrate that the truth is precisely that there is no God. But this type of general theory of knowledge betrays its own methodological character in essential points. The enormous gaps in our knowledge are filled by a series of mythological, theatrical props with a fictitious rationality that will not deceive anyone. It is an obvious fact that the rational character of the universe cannot be explained rationally on the basis of something irrational. This is why the logos that is at the origin of all things remains more than ever the best hypothesis, although this is, of course, a hypothesis that demands that we give up a position where it is we who are in charge, and that we take the risk of assuming the position of humble listeners. Even in our days, we cannot say that the tranquil, evidential character of God has been eliminated, but we must admit that it has been made more than ever unrecognizable by the violence that power and profit inflict upon us. In this way, the contemporary situation is fundamentally marked by that same tension between opposite tendencies which runs through the whole of history. On the one side, there is the interior opening up of the human soul to God, but on the other side, there is the stronger attraction of our needs and our immediate experiences. Man is the battlefield where these two contend with each other. He is not capable of sloughing off God completely, nor does he have the strength to set out on the journey toward him. On his own, he is not capable of constructing a bridge that could establish a concrete relationship with this God. We can continue to affirm with St. Thomas that unbelief is contrary to nature, but we must at once add that man is not able to clear up wholly the strange chiaroscuro that weighs down the questions concerning the eternal realities. If a genuine relationship is to come into existence, God must take the initiative. It is He who must come to meet man and address him. (4) Supernatural faith and its origins. But how can this take place? This question takes us back to our initial reflections on the structure of faith, since our reply consists of the affirmation that the Word of God reaches us through the mediation of men who have heard it and touched it, men who know Him at first hand, so to speak. In order to grasp this, we must reflect on the structure of knowledge and faith which we set out above. We said that while faith has the character of a non-autonomous knowledge, at the same time it involves a factor of mutual trust, whereby the knowledge of the other becomes my own knowledge. Hence, this factor of trust contains an element of participation. By means of my act of trust, I become a sharer in the knowledge of another. This is what we might call the social aspect of the phenomenon of faith. No one knows everything, but all of us together know what it is necessary to know. Faith constitutes a network of reciprocal dependence that at the same time is a network of mutual solidarity, where each one sustains the other and is sustained by him. This fundamental anthropological structure can also be seen in our relationship with God, where it finds its original form and its integrating center. Our knowledge of God is essentially based on this reciprocity, on a trust that becomes participation and is subsequently verified in the experience of each individual's life. The relationship with God is also, and indeed before all else, a relationship with men. It is based on a communion among men. We can also say that the communication that is specific to the relationship with God confers its most radical potential on human communication, raising it from the level of utilitarian interest to that level which is fundamental for the person. If I am to accept as my own this knowledge of others that I am offered, and to experience its reality in my personal life, it is of course necessary that I myself should be open to God. The voice of the Eternal can reach me through the mediation of the other person only if there is in me an organ capable of receiving it. In this sense, the shared knowledge of God that comes to me from others is more personal than the knowledge I share with the technician or specialist. The knowledge of God requires an interior vigilance, a spirituality, and an openness of the heart that becomes personally aware, in silence and recollection, that there exists a direct access to the Creator. Nevertheless, it is true that God does not disclose himself to an isolated ego. God does not accept a merely individualistic exclusiveness. Our relationship to him is linked to our brothers and sisters. At this point, an unexpected path opens up before us. We have said that what we call natural faith, by which we trust results that we cannot verify on our own, finds its justification in the knowledge of those who are familiar with the subject in general, or who have themselves examined one specific question. Although such a faith retains for the one involved its character as faith, it appeals nevertheless to what another has seen. When we spoke of the religious question at the beginning of this lecture, it appeared that precisely this decisive element was lacking in supernatural religious faith. That, at least, was the initial impression. Here, there is no one who sees how things are, and it seems that we are never anything else but believers. This seemed to be the core of the problem of religious faith. But now we must say that that impression was misleading. In supernatural faith, too, there are a multitude who live from a small number of persons, and this small number lives for the multitude. Similarly, in the things of God, we are not all like blind people who grope their way forward in the dark. Here, too, there are persons who are permitted to see. Christ says of the father of the great family of Israel, "Abraham saw my day and was glad." Christ is there at the very center of history as the great man who sees, and all his words flow from his immediate contact with the Father. As for us, the word that refers to our situation is, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." In its innermost essence, the Christian faith is a participation in this act whereby Jesus sees. His act of seeing makes possible his word, which is the authentic expression of what he sees. Accordingly, what Jesus sees is the point of reference for our faith, the specific place where it is anchored. 5. Development of premises. These fundamental premises imply a series of consequences I should like to develop briefly. 1. Faith is anchored in what Jesus and the saints see. Jesus, he who knows God directly, sees him. This is why he is the true mediator between God and man. His human act of seeing the divine reality is the source of light for all men. Nevertheless, we must not regard Jesus himself as one totally isolated, pushing him back into a remote historical past. We have already spoken of Abraham. Let us now add that the light of Jesus is reflected in the saints and shines out through them. But the saints are not only those persons who have been explicitly canonized. There are always hidden saints, too, who receive in their communion with Jesus a ray of his splendor, a concrete and real experience of God. To spell out what this fact means, we can perhaps take up a mysterious expression that the Old Testament uses when it tells the story of Moses. Even if it is not possible to see him fully face to face, he nevertheless sees God, for he sees at least his back. And just as Moses' face shone after this encounter with God, so the light of Jesus shines forth through the life of these men. St. Thomas Aquinas begins with this affirmation in his demonstration of the scientific character of theology. We should note that, according to Aristotle, all the sciences are interrelated within a system of reciprocal explanation and dependence. None of the sciences demonstrates or reflects everything. Each of them, in one way or another, presupposes justifications that it originally draws from some other science. For Aristotle, there is only one science that penetrates to the genuine foundations of all human knowledge, and this is why he calls it the first philosophy. All the other sciences presuppose at least this fundamental reflection, and are therefore scientiae subalternatae, subaltern sciences constructed on one or more other sciences. St. Thomas inserts his explanation of theology into this general theory of science. He says that, in this sense, theology too is a subaltern science that does not see, nor does theology itself examine its own ultimate foundations. It depends on the science of the saints, on what they see. Their act of seeing is the reference point of theological thinking and the guarantee of its legitimacy. It follows that the work of the theologian is secondary with regard to the real experience of the saints. Without this reference point, without the deep anchoring in such an experience, his work becomes detached from reality. This is the humility demanded of the theologian. Without the realism of the saints, without their contact with the reality of which theology speaks, it degenerates into an empty intellectual game, and also loses its scientific character. 2. The verification of faith in life. When we put our confidence in what Jesus sees and believe in his word, we are not in fact moving around in total darkness. The good news of Jesus corresponds to an interior expectation in our heart. It corresponds to an internal light in our being that reaches out to the truth of God. Certainly we are before all else believers at second hand. But St. Thomas is right to describe faith as a process, as an interior path, when he writes, "The light of faith leads us to see." In his Gospel, St. John draws our attention several times to this process. For example, in the episode of the Samaritan woman, who relates what happened to her when she met Jesus, and how she recognized in him the Messiah. The Savior discloses to her the path of God, and then introduces her to the knowledge of him which is the source of life. The fact that it is precisely this woman who says this compels the people in her village to listen to her words. They believe in Jesus because of the woman. That is, they believe at second hand. Nevertheless, they invite Jesus to stay with them, and so enter into dialogue with him. And at the end, they can tell the woman, "It is no longer because of your words that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world." In the living encounter, faith is transformed into knowledge. It would of course be wrong to imagine the subsequent path of faith as a linear process, as an untrammeled development. Since this path is linked to our life with all its ups and downs, we keep experiencing setbacks that oblige us to start anew. Every phase of life has to discover its own specific maturity, for otherwise we fall back into the corresponding immaturity. And yet, we can say that the life of faith also permits the growth of an evidential character of the faith. Its reality touches us, and the experience of a successful life of faith assures us that Jesus is truly the Savior of the world. Here, the second aspect we have just evoked joins the first aspect. In the New Testament, the word saints designated Christians as a whole, who certainly did not possess all the qualities that are required in a canonized saint. But this designation expressed the fact that all were called, in virtue of their experience of the risen Lord, to become a point of reference for others, thus putting them in contact with Jesus' act of seeing the living God. This remains true even today. A believer who allows himself to be formed and guided by the Church's faith, no matter what his weaknesses and difficulties may be, ought to be a window opened onto the light of the living God. And if he genuinely believes, that is what he is. The believer ought to be a force of opposition to the powers that keep the truth a prisoner, and to the wall of prejudices that prevents people from seeing God. A faith that is still inchoate ought in some way to find support in him. Just as the Samaritan woman became a living invitation to meet Jesus, so too, in the darkness of a world that is largely opposed to God, the faith of believers is an essential reference point in the search for God. 3. Faith's I, you, and we. The mediatory intervention of Jesus and that of the saints, which derives from his, converge in a third reflection. The act of faith is an eminently personal act, anchored in the most intimate depths of the human I. But precisely by being so personal, it is at the same time an act of communication. In the depths of its nature, the I is always linked to the you, and vice versa. An authentic relationship that becomes communication can be born only from the depths of the person. We have said that believing means sharing in what Jesus sees, relying on Jesus. St. John, who leans on the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper, is a symbol of what faith as such signifies. To believe is to communicate with Jesus, freeing oneself thereby from the repression that is contrary to the truth, freeing my own I, which is shut up in its own self, and making my I a response to the Father, a response to the yes of love, the yes pronounced over our existence, that yes which is our redemption and which overcomes the world. In its most intimate nature, faith is therefore a way of being with someone, of shattering that isolation of my I, which is also its malady. The faith opens out onto the distant horizon, breaking down the barriers of my subjectivity. It is this that Paul describes when he says, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." The I, dissolved, rediscovers itself in a new and larger I. Paul describes this process whereby the first I dissolves and wakes up in a larger I as a rebirth. In this new I, in which liberating faith immerses me, I do not, however, discover that I am united only to Jesus. I am united likewise to all those who have walked along the same path. In other words, faith is necessarily an ecclesial act. It lives and moves in the we of the Church, since it makes us one with the I communion of Jesus Christ. In this new subject, the wall separating myself and the others collapses, the wall that separates my subjectivity from the external world and makes it inaccessible to me, the wall between me and the depths of being. In this new subject, I become a contemporary of Jesus, and all the experiences of the Church belong to me. They have become my own experiences. Naturally, this new birth is not the work of an instant. It lasts throughout the whole course of my life. The essential point here is that I cannot construct my own personal faith in a private dialogue with Jesus. If faith does not live in this we, it does not live at all. It is impossible to separate faith and life, or truth and life, I and we. It is only within an existence lived in the we of believers, in the we of the Church, that faith unfolds its own logic and takes on its own organic form. Let us sum up. As in the questions of every day, so too in our relationship with God, we can find a path forward only by sharing in the knowledge of others. In our relationship with God, those who see and those who experience are present, and we can rely on them in our own faith. In some way they bestow their own certainty on us. We make up the multitude, but we are not simply blind vis-à-vis God. Relying on those who see, we advance gradually toward Him, and the buried memory of God, which is written on the heart of every man, awakens more and more to life in the depths of our own being. When we live close to God, our sight is restored. When we use our eyes, they bear witness to His truth. Pascal's advice to his friend may seem skeptical, but it is correct. Begin with the folly of faith, and you will attain knowledge. This folly is wisdom. This folly is the path of truth. Cardinal Ratzinger gave this lecture at the School of Catholic Culture in Santa Croce in Bassano.